They're already here. Dain Veydris stood at the edge of the ruined observation deck, his gloved fingers tightening around the grip of his rifle. The glassless window framed a city that no longer belonged to its people. Alien patrols stalked the avenues below, their armored boots crushing shattered concrete, their towering forms silhouetted against the cold flicker of burning streetlights. 5 months, muttered Dain Veydris, his second-in-command crouched beside him. His breath curled in the frigid night air. 5 months, and they still think they own this place. Dain didn't respond. He watched the invaders move in mechanical formations, their elongated visors scanning for movement. They believed they had broken humanity. The banners of the Galactic Council fluttered over the remains of Earth's capital, draped over the ruins like some imperial shroud. But the banners didn't mean control. They meant something else. Bait. The air smelled of charred metal and old blood, the bitter remnants of another failed pacification attempt. The Council had expected submission. What they got was something far worse. Silence. The kind that preceded a killing blow. In the distance, an alien officer barked commands in his guttural dialect, his words clipped and impatient. Dain noted the sluggishness in their movements, the subtle stagger in their steps. Gravity sickness. Their biology wasn't built for this world's pull, no matter how many exoskeletal supports they strapped to their limbs. Earth had become a noose tightening around their necks, and they were too arrogant to realize it. "Are they taking the bait?" Dain asked, adjusting the lens on his modified scope. Dain shifted his gaze toward the central plaza, where an abandoned supply convoy sat idle, its cargo crates neatly stacked. Weapons, medical supplies, rations, or so it seemed. "They will." His voice was quiet, certain. Below, a squad of council enforcers approached the convoy, their rifles raised, movements cautious but laced with entitlement, as if they had earned the right to plunder. The leader, a high-ranked officer clad in reinforced combat plating, motioned for 2 subordinates to inspect the nearest crate. One of them stepped forward, his multi-jointed fingers prying open the latches. The moment the seal broke, the night exploded. A detonation ripped through the plaza, a blinding inferno swallowing the entire squad. Shockwaves slammed against crumbling buildings, sending debris cascading onto the patrols below. The air filled with the dull, wet sounds of collapsing bodies, followed by the shrieks of the wounded. Dain watched impassively as a secondary blast ruptured through the street, swallowing another patrol in its wake. Firelight danced in the reflection of his visor, but his hands remained steady, his heartbeat even. The resistance had begun another hunt. Dain exhaled sharply. "That'll send their command scrambling." "They'll retaliate," Dain replied, his voice unreadable. He motioned toward the distant glow of an enemy command post nestled within the remnants of Earth's former government district. "Good. Let them." The Council would respond with force, overwhelming, arrogant force. It was their way. A show of dominance, as if brute strength alone could reassert control. They had learned nothing in 5 months. They still mistook humanity's silence for surrender. Dain's earpiece crackled to life. "Alpha team in position," a clipped voice reported. "Confirmed," Dain responded. His attention never wavered from the approaching reinforcements, armored transports rolling in with ground-shaking weight. The plan was unfolding as it always did, systematic, calculated, inevitable. The convoy explosion wasn't just an attack. It was a signal, one the Council didn't understand yet. They would soon. The command center was suffocating with tension. Chancellor Veltan's rigid frame loomed over a heads-up display, his slitted pupils narrowing as he replayed the detonation footage for the 3rd time. He could hear the strained breathing of his officers, the nervous shifts of their posture. They were waiting for him to say something, to decide the appropriate level of retaliation. Cowards. "This," his voice came slow, controlled, carrying the weight of suppressed fury, "is unacceptable." No one spoke. Veltan turned sharply. "Did we not establish absolute control? Did we not eradicate their infrastructure? Where is the submission we were promised?" A junior strategist hesitated before speaking. Humans appear to be employing non-traditional warfare, Chancellor. Non-traditional. Veltan's fingers curled into fists. That was their euphemism for chaos. This is not warfare, he seethed. This is pest control. His officers remained silent, their postures rigid. He could sense their unspoken doubts. A general shifted uneasily. We could escalate, Chancellor. Deploy aerial bombardments. Wipe out entire districts if necessary. Veltan exhaled through flared nostrils. It was tempting. Burn it all down. Let the ashes surrender. But he knew the truth. They needed this world intact. The Council had invaded not out of mercy or duty, but out of fear. Earth had become too unpredictable, too volatile, too much of a threat. No empire could afford a threat it couldn't understand. Veltan straightened. Triple the patrols, increase curfew enforcement, and find out who leads this rebellion. His voice dropped to something colder. I want their head. Hours later, deep within the underground tunnels that webbed beneath the ruined city, Dain Veydris listened to intercepted transmissions with quiet satisfaction. Veltan's reaction had been predictable. The Council would tighten its grip, stretch its forces thinner. A slow suffocation. Curfews, checkpoints, reinforcements, Arden muttered, reading the decrypted orders. They're trying to put a tourniquet on a severed limb. Dain didn't smile, but something flickered in his expression. Let them. The more they spread themselves, the easier they'll break. Across the dimly lit war room, Ryland Castor hunched over a laser plasma display, fingers gliding across a network of intercepted Council data. A former chief engineer in a world that no longer had a government, Castor had repurposed his talents for a new mission, turning the invaders' own technology against them. He gestured to a segment of code scrolling across the display. Their primary warships are cycling through automated diagnostics every 20 hours. If I can slip a viral override into their next cycle, I can make them blind to incoming projectile fire. Arden let out a low whistle. That means they won't see us coming. Dain nodded. Good. Keep working on it. He turned back to the dimly lit tunnels stretching into the abyss, his thoughts already 3 steps ahead. The Council thought they were hunting the Resistance. They didn't realize the Resistance was hunting them, not just for survival, not just for war, for something far worse, for vengeance. The tunnels carried the weight of something unspoken. A low, ceaseless drip of condensation echoed through the concrete veins beneath the ruined city. A whisper of the world above, broken, bleeding, waiting. Dain Veydris walked without hesitation, his steps muffled by the dirt-packed ground. The underground resistance network stretched for miles, a labyrinth carved from old metro systems, maintenance corridors, and forgotten bunkers. It was not built for comfort. It was built for war. Behind him, Arden Vass rolled his shoulders, a deep breath forcing away the stiffness that crept into his frame after too many nights without sleep. I'll never get used to the air down here, he muttered, adjusting the rifle slung across his back. It's like breathing through cloth. Dain didn't slow. You want fresher air? Go topside. See how long your lungs last. Arden exhaled sharply, somewhere between a laugh and a curse. Fair point. Ahead, a narrow corridor opened into the main war room, a cavernous expanse cut into the bedrock, illuminated by dim, repurposed power cells. The space pulsed with activity. Engineers worked over salvaged alien tech, weaponsmiths assembled makeshift armaments, strategists murmured over heads-up displays that flickered with intercepted enemy transmissions. The scent of oil, damp stone, and sweat hung heavy in the air, the byproduct of too many bodies crammed into too little space. Ryland Castor barely looked up from his workstation, his fingers moving in quick, methodical motions across a complex series of encryptions. The former engineer was the closest thing the Resistance had to a miracle worker when it came to subverting the Council's technological superiority. If anyone could turn the enemy's own infrastructure against them, it was him. Dain approached. Status? Castor pushed back from the console, rubbing his temple. I've slipped the virus into their fleet's next diagnostic cycle. The moment it executes, their orbital scanners are blind to kinetic projectiles. He exhaled, shaking his head. This won't hold forever, though. Once they realize their systems are compromised, they'll reset their entire framework. We have a window, but it's closing. Dain studied the shifting data on the heads-up display. The network of enemy strongholds was tightening, their occupation forces repositioning in response to the earlier convoy detonation. They were spreading out, reinforcing their outer defenses, trying to cut off the resistance from key supply routes. It was an overcorrection, one that made them vulnerable in ways they didn't yet realize. They're shifting their priority to containment, Arden noted, arms crossed. Means they still think we're rats in the walls. Dain's jaw tightened. Let them think it. Rats don't fight fair. A transmission crackled through their comms, sharp and urgent. Sector 9 patrols converging on the eastern ruins. They're moving faster than expected. Dain's mind clicked into motion. How many? 2 squads. Heavy armor. Looks like they're trying to lock down the tunnels leading to our supply caches. Arden shifted. They're closing the noose. Dain shook his head. They're walking into it. He turned, already issuing commands. Caster, keep monitoring their systems. The moment they realize their scanners are blind, I want to know. Arden, with me. They moved swiftly, weapons checked, gear secured. The tunnels opened into the night like the throat of a beast, swallowing them into the ruins of the city above. The wind carried the scent of burning polymer and scorched stone, remnants of the latest purge. Somewhere in the distance, an automated warning system blared in alien dialect, curfew enforcement protocols, a last attempt at asserting control over a world that no longer listened. Dain crouched behind the wreckage of a toppled transport, his gaze locking onto the advancing enemy patrols. The Council's foot soldiers moved with rigid efficiency, their rifles sweeping the ruins in controlled arcs. Their armor gleamed under the broken glow of street lamps, visors scanning for heat signatures. They were methodical, calculated, but they weren't hunters. They were prey that had wandered into a field of waiting blades. Arden settled beside him, breath slow, steady. I count 10. Heavy ordnance. They're expecting resistance. Dain's gaze didn't waver. They'll get it. He activated his comm. Delta team, position? Set. Awaiting go-ahead. Dain's fingers curled around the trigger of his rifle. Make it loud. A beat of silence. Then the sky split apart. A concussive explosion shattered the night, hurling debris through the air as the first of the enemy's armored transports erupted into a firestorm. The patrol scattered, shouting commands in their guttural tongue, their formation splintering under the sudden chaos. Dain moved, fast. The first shot took an officer through the throat, the impact spinning him sideways before he hit the ground. Arden's rifle snapped, sending another soldier crumpling backward, his visor shattered. The remaining forces scrambled for cover, their weapons firing blind into the dark. Delta team, push forward. Figures moved through the ruins, darting between cover, rifles barking short, efficient bursts. The enemy struggled to recalibrate, their training faltering under the unpredictability of human warfare. They weren't built for this. An enemy that struck from the shadows, vanished, then struck again. One of the remaining officers shouted something in a desperate attempt at regrouping. He never finished. A well-placed charge detonated beneath his position, sending him skyward in a bloom of dust and flame. Dain drove forward, closing the distance with brutal efficiency. The last soldier standing turned, weapon raised. Too slow. A knife slid between the seams of his armor, severing the arterial conduit beneath. He gurgled, staggered, then collapsed. Silence settled over the ruins, broken only by the flicker of flames and the distant wail of a council distress signal. Arden exhaled, rolling his shoulders. That's one less patrol on our doorstep. Dain wiped his blade against his sleeve before sheathing it. There'll be more. Castor's voice cut through the comms. Enemy command is scrambling. They're pulling back forces from secondary zones to reinforce key installations. It's working, Veydris. We're forcing them into a corner. Dain looked out over the ruined city, the banners of the council still draped over shattered monuments. They thought they had conquered Earth, but Earth was never theirs to take. Dain Veydris crouched atop the skeletal remains of a crumbling high-rise, his gaze fixed on the council's forward base, sprawled across what was once a human metropolis. The wind carried the distant echoes of strained voices, boots crunching over shattered pavement, and the mechanical whir of automated defenses adjusting their targeting parameters. The enemy was shifting, adapting. Too little, too late. Behind him, Arden Vass adjusted the focus on his scope, muttering under his breath. They're nervous. You can see it in the way they move. Too stiff, too careful. This isn't standard patrol behavior. Dain didn't reply. His fingers traced the worn grip of his rifle as his mind dissected the battlefield below. The council had fortified the intersection with portable barricades, heavy gunners posted at every entrance. More soldiers patrolled the perimeter in staggered formations, their armor scuffed, movements sluggish under the burden of Earth's unrelenting gravity. They were exhausted. They're expecting another strike, Arden continued. You think they're finally starting to learn? Dain's voice was quiet, detached. They're just afraid of ghosts. The resistance had turned the city into a battlefield without borders, a war zone with no clear front lines. Council troops vanished mid-patrol, their remains found days later with no explanation. Ammunition caches self-detonated, supply lines collapsed under the weight of well-placed sabotage, and entire platoons reported hearing voices whispering through their comm channels. Voices that should not exist. It wasn't just the resistance fighting back. It was the planet itself. Castor's voice crackled through the comms. Intercepted chatter confirms they've already requested reinforcements. High Command isn't sending them. Dain's grip tightened slightly. They're cutting their losses. A pause. Then, looks like it. The Council's arrogance had been their undoing. They had believed Earth was just another conquest, another world to bend beneath their empire's weight. But Earth did not break. It crushed. A sharp chime from the heads-up display flickered in Castor's bunker, its dull glow illuminating his face. His fingers moved with practiced ease across the interface, decrypting an incoming transmission. It was rushed, erratic, Council encryption, but sloppily coded. He frowned. That's not standard protocol. Dain's voice filtered through the channel. Explain. Castor exhaled, his mind already working through possible scenarios. They're attempting a frequency shift like they're trying to cut off external signals. This isn't just about blocking resistance communications. It's like they don't want their own people talking. Arden shot Dain a look. Internal mutiny? Or worse, Castor muttered. They're panicking. Dain turned his attention back to the streets below. If the Council was severing its own communications, it meant their chain of command was beginning to fracture. Their soldiers, malnourished, sleep-deprived, and drowning in paranoia, were losing confidence in their leadership. Fear was setting in. Dain stood, dust shaking loose from his boots. Let's make it worse. Chancellor Veltan's hands curled into fists, his elongated fingers pressing into the cold surface of his command console. The air in the control chamber was thick with tension, officers exchanging uneasy glances as they watched their leader through lowered eyes. The Chancellor's usual rigid composure was cracking, small fractures forming in the foundation of his authority. The latest battle report scrolled across the laser plasma display. Casualties were rising. Supply lines were disintegrating. Entire squads had ceased responding. And the worst part, they didn't know how. This was not war as the Council understood it. There were no decisive skirmishes, no tactical victories, no territorial gains. Every confrontation was a slow, unrelenting dismantling. Veltan's gaze flickered to the figures gathered before him. Status on the containment zones. One of his generals, a seasoned officer with rigid posture and a fading air of confidence, cleared his throat. We've secured the southern districts, but resistance activity has increased near the central spire. We lost another outpost last night. Veltan's teeth ground together. And the culprits? The general hesitated. No bodies were recovered. No survivors. Silence strangled the room. Veltan exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping against the console in measured beats. "How many soldiers have reported symptoms?" The room tensed. No one wanted to speak first. Finally, a technician murmured, "Over 200 cases confirmed. Symptoms range from severe fatigue and muscular failure to—" He swallowed. "Hallucinations." Veltan's expression darkened. "You think this is psychological warfare?" The technician hesitated. "With respect, Chancellor, the report suggests it's something more. Some of the troops claim they're seeing things that— Superstition." Veltan's voice was sharp, slicing through the unspoken fear coiling in the chamber. The soldiers were breaking down. He had seen it before. Troops lost in unfamiliar terrain, morale shattered by the weight of an unseen enemy. The difference was, this time, he could feel it too. The walls of his command center, once a fortress of logic and structure, now felt too small. The air carried an unnatural stillness, pressing against his skin like a warning. Something was wrong with this world. The first screams tore through the night. Dain and Arden moved quickly through the abandoned corridors of a council outpost, stepping over bodies that had not been there an hour ago. The soldiers had been killed without a fight, rifles untouched, armor intact, their visors shattered from within. Arden exhaled, low and steady. "We didn't do this." Dain knelt beside one of the corpses, his fingers tracing the jagged edges of the fractured visor. The expression beneath was frozen in terror, eyes wide, mouth twisted in a silent scream. "No," he murmured. "We didn't." A deep, mechanical groan echoed through the structure as automated defenses flickered, sensors scrambling to detect a threat they could not comprehend. Castor's voice cut in through the comms, laced with static. "I just lost feed from 3 council bases. No transmissions, no distress calls. They just stopped." Arden stiffened. "That's not possible." Dain rose slowly, his mind working through the implications. The resistance had been methodical, but they had not wiped out entire bases overnight. Something else had. He glanced toward the shattered visor once more. There was something new in the war now, something the Council had never accounted for. Dain activated his comm. "Castor, keep watching the feeds. If another base goes dark, I want to know before they do." "Understood," came the terse reply. Arden adjusted his grip on his rifle, gaze flickering toward the shadows stretching across the corridor walls. "So, what's the play now?" Dain stared into the growing dark, pulse steady, mind sharp. "We keep pushing." And in the silence that followed, the Council's nightmare deepened. Something was hunting them. Dain Veydris felt it in the silence that followed every missing patrol, in the fractured transmissions intercepted from Council frequencies. Entire garrisons vanished overnight. No bodies left behind. No distress calls made. It wasn't the resistance. It wasn't the sabotage networks. It was something else. And the Council was finally beginning to understand it. Standing in the wreckage of another fallen outpost, he scanned the destruction. A makeshift command post had been reduced to debris. Alien bodies slumped over consoles, their visors shattered inward, expressions frozen in horror. No bullet wounds, no burns from plasma fire, just death. Arden Vass stood beside him, arms crossed, gaze flickering between the corpses. "This isn't our doing." Dain knelt beside an officer's remains, gloved fingers brushing over the fractured armor. The chest plate had been dented. From the inside, something had ruptured within the body, forcing its way out. "Not unless we suddenly learned how to kill without touching them." He straightened, scanning the empty corridors. "They don't even know what hit them." Castor's voice crackled over the comms. "I've tapped into their emergency channels. The higher-ups are rattled. They're ordering fleet-wide quarantines, isolating any units that show irregularities. They think it's a biological agent." Arden let out a short, humorless breath. "That's their explanation? That some sickness is tearing through their armor?" Dain said nothing. He knew the truth. The planet was fighting back. He had seen the signs long before the Council ever set foot on Earth. The way their early scouting teams had gone silent, the way their environmental suits had begun failing, how their bioadaptive tech never quite adjusted to Earth's atmosphere. This world had been a crucible for life, shaped by billions of years of war between predator and prey. The Council had thought themselves above that struggle. They were wrong. "Command's on edge," Castor continued. "They've pulled most of their forces back into fortified strongholds, but their ground units are trapped. No ships are landing. No one's coming to help them." Arden shook his head. "So what? They just leave their own to die?" Dain glanced back at the dead officers. "They don't have a choice." The Council had built its empire on the assumption that they were the apex species, that their technology would render any natural threat irrelevant. But now, the creatures they had considered weak, primitive, conquerable, had turned their own planet into a weapon, and for the first time in history, the Council had no countermeasure. Inside the reinforced walls of the central command spire, Chancellor Veltan paced before the laser plasma display, his jaw tight as he scanned the fragmented reports. The fortress was eerily quiet, the usual hum of Council operations replaced with anxious stillness. The personnel left inside, the ones deemed uncontaminated, moved through the halls with careful, deliberate steps, as if afraid to disturb something unseen. Veltan didn't believe in ghosts, but this world made him reconsider. The latest reports were bleak. Entire battalions missing, outposts abandoned, their distress beacons transmitting into the void with no response. His men whispered of something moving through the ruins at night, shadows that didn't belong, sounds that carried no source. "Status of Fleet Command?" he demanded. A nearby officer cleared his throat. "They've declined your request for full planetary extraction, Chancellor." Veltan froze. "Declined?" The officer hesitated. "The High Council believes this situation is containable. They fear that—" Veltan turned sharply, voice cold. "They fear?" He took a step closer, towering over the smaller alien. "They fear what exactly?" A beat of silence. Then, quietly, "They fear we are already lost." For a moment the room was utterly still. Veltan inhaled, slow and controlled, the weight of realization settling into his bones. The Council would not send reinforcements. They would not risk their fleets against whatever was consuming his army from within. They had abandoned him. His gaze swept the chamber. Every officer, every soldier standing before him. They knew it too. He could see it in the tension in their shoulders, the way their hands hovered too close to their weapons. They weren't waiting for orders. They were waiting for confirmation of what they already knew. They were on their own. Veltan turned back to the display, where real-time satellite feeds mapped out the shifting battle lines. If no reinforcements were coming, then the only path forward was annihilation. "Activate orbital bombardments," he ordered. The room tensed. One of the generals stiffened. "Chancellor, our own forces are still within—" "I don't care." Veltan's voice cut through the chamber like a blade. "We burn them out. Every city, every ruin, every shadow they think they can hide in. We reduce it to nothing." The officers hesitated. Some of them exchanged glances. But in the end, they obeyed, because they were more afraid of him than they were of whatever was lurking beyond the walls. For now. Dain Veydris felt the first tremors before the attack came, a distant, growing rumble, the kind that made the air itself tighten. He looked up just in time to see the sky ignite. Arden cursed. "They're wiping their own." The horizon lit up as Council warships launched their assault, streaks of fire carving across the night. The bombardment slammed into the earth with devastating force, entire blocks collapsing beneath the first wave of destruction. Buildings caved like brittle shells, shockwaves rippling through the ruins as the ground itself shuddered from the impact. Flames roared through the wreckage, smoke curling in thick, suffocating spirals. The acrid sting of scorched debris filled Dain's throat, heat licking at his skin as he ducked behind a crumbling wall. "They're scared," Castor's voice came through the comms, slightly distorted from interference. "This is desperation." Dain's jaw tightened as he surveyed the carnage. The Council wasn't fighting anymore. They were erasing. But they had made one fatal miscalculation. Dain activated his comm. "Castor, status on their orbital defenses?" A brief pause, then, "Still compromised." A slow, dark satisfaction settled in Dain's chest. The council believed they were in control, that they could burn away their problems with fire and brute force. But they had overlooked one crucial flaw. They had just given humanity a clear shot. Dain turned to Arden, eyes sharp with unspoken intent. "We move now." Arden nodded, already adjusting his rifle. "About time." Dain activated the comms once more, voice cold and unyielding. "Delta teams, engage. Caster, initiate Phase 3. Fire consumed the city's corpse, the night sky torn open by falling debris and streaks of plasma fire. Council warships loomed in low orbit, their cannons vomiting destruction upon the streets below. The once majestic skyline had become a graveyard of broken steel and collapsed towers, the choking weight of dust turning the air into something thick, something suffocating. Dain Veydris moved through the ruins like a shadow, boots cutting through layers of soot and shattered glass. The ground trembled beneath another orbital strike, a shockwave roaring through the crumbling infrastructure as an entire district was reduced to glowing rubble. Somewhere in the distance, a council command vehicle screeched, a garbled distress call, cutting off mid-transmission as resistance forces tore through another garrison. "They're breaking," Ardenvas murmured beside him, rifle resting against his shoulder. "Not fighting anymore, just running." Dain didn't respond. He watched, silent, as the last of the patrol tried to pull back, bodies silhouetted against the burning wreckage of their former stronghold. They moved in disarray, once proud warriors, now little more than panicked creatures scrambling toward extraction points that no longer existed, because the council wasn't coming to save them. A voice crackled in Dain's earpiece. "Caster, orbital defenses are down. We've got open skies." Dain's jaw tightened. "Then we take them before they leave." He turned, signaling to the scattered teams hidden among the ruins. Resistance fighters emerged from the wreckage, their weapons leveled, movements cold and methodical. They weren't soldiers. They were executioners. "I don't care." Velton's voice cut through the chamber like a blade. "We burn them out. Every city, every ruin, every shadow they think they can hide in. We reduce it to nothing." The officers hesitated. Some of them exchanged glances. But in the end, they obeyed, because they were more afraid of him than they were of whatever was lurking beyond the walls. For now. Dain Veydris felt the first tremors before the attack came, a distant, growing rumble, the kind that made the air itself tighten. He looked up just in time to see the sky ignite. Arden cursed. "They're wiping their own." The horizon lit up as council warships launched their assault, streaks of fire carving across the night. The bombardment slammed into the earth with devastating force, entire blocks collapsing beneath the first wave of destruction. Buildings caved like brittle shells, shockwaves rippling through the ruins as the ground itself shuddered from the impact. Flames roared through the wreckage, smoke curling in thick, suffocating spirals. The acrid sting of scorched debris filled Dain's throat, heat licking at his skin as he ducked behind a crumbling wall. "They're scared," Caster's voice came through the comms, slightly distorted from interference. "This is desperation." Dain's jaw tightened as he surveyed the carnage. The council wasn't fighting anymore. They were erasing. But they had made one fatal miscalculation. Dain activated his comm. "Caster, status on their orbital defenses?" A brief pause, then, "Still compromised." A slow, dark satisfaction settled in Dain's chest. The council believed they were in control, that they could burn away their problems with fire and brute force. But they had overlooked one crucial flaw. They had just given humanity a clear shot. Dain turned to Arden, eyes sharp with unspoken intent. "We move now." Arden nodded, already adjusting his rifle. "About time." Dain activated the comms once more, voice cold and unyielding. "Delta teams, engage. Caster, initiate Phase 3. Fire consumed the city's corpse, the night sky torn open by falling debris and streaks of plasma fire. Council warships loomed in low orbit, their cannons vomiting destruction upon the streets below. The once majestic skyline had become a graveyard of broken steel and collapsed towers, the choking weight of dust turning the air into something thick, something suffocating. Dain Veydris moved through the ruins like a shadow, boots cutting through layers of soot and shattered glass. The ground trembled beneath another orbital strike, a shockwave roaring through the crumbling infrastructure as an entire district was reduced to glowing rubble. Somewhere in the distance, a council command vehicle screeched, a garbled distress call, cutting off mid-transmission as resistance forces tore through another garrison. "They're breaking," Ardenvas murmured beside him, rifle resting against his shoulder. "Not fighting anymore, just running." Dain didn't respond. He watched, silent, as the last of the patrol tried to pull back, bodies silhouetted against the burning wreckage of their former stronghold. They moved in disarray, once proud warriors, now little more than panicked creatures scrambling toward extraction points that no longer existed, because the council wasn't coming to save them. A voice crackled in Dain's earpiece. "Castor, orbital defenses are down. We've got open skies." Dain's jaw tightened. "Then we take them before they leave." He turned, signaling to the scattered teams hidden among the ruins. Resistance fighters emerged from the wreckage, their weapons leveled, movements cold and methodical. They weren't soldiers. They were executioners. Arden exhaled. "No mercy?" Dain met his gaze. "They didn't give any when they landed." Arden nodded. That was all that needed to be said. The strike was immediate. Sniper fire snapped through the night, council officers dropping where they stood, their armor offering no protection against tungsten-tipped rounds. Explosives gutted the retreating convoy, armored transports torn apart in fiery eruptions that sent bodies hurtling through the air. Dain advanced, weaving through the chaos, his rifle barking short, controlled bursts. A council soldier turned, desperation in his alien eyes, hands raised, not in surrender, but in plea. Dain shot him through the skull and kept walking. Inside the command spire, Chancellor Veltan watched the massacre unfold through the heads-up display, his face devoid of expression. The command chamber had grown colder in the last hour, the silence heavier, the officers standing behind him shifting uneasily. He could hear them breathing, hear the unspoken terror settling into their bones. "Status of fleet extraction?" he asked, voice level. An officer hesitated before answering. 30% of ground forces remain stranded. Our ships, they are not landing, Chancellor. They refuse." Veltan didn't look away from the display. "Refuse?" A beat of silence. "Sir, they fear contamination. The reports—" Veltan turned, slow and deliberate. "I do not concern myself with fear. I concern myself with results. And so far, what you have given me is nothing." The officer swallowed hard, his fingers twitching at his sides. "Sir, if we do not retreat soon, then we lose the war." Veltan let the words settle, watching the weight of them drag down the morale in the room. Then he exhaled, measured, controlled. "Contact Fleet Command. Tell them the only contamination they should fear is my wrath." The officer gave a stiff nod, before hurrying to relay the order. Veltan turned back to the display, watching the last of his ground forces be slaughtered. Something bitter curled in his gut. The war had shifted, and not in his favor. Dain wiped the sweat from his brow, the heat of the burning district pressing against his skin. The battle had turned into something else, a purge. The council was no longer holding territory. They were barely holding formation. Their once indomitable legions had been reduced to scattered bands of survivors, their commanding officers either dead or frantically attempting to establish contact with a fleet that had already abandoned them. "They're falling back to the central spire," Castor's voice came through the comms, laced with static. "Veltan's still holed up in there. Must be the last holdout." Dain nodded to himself. "Then we take it." Arden lifted a brow. "We storm the most fortified building on the planet?" Dain tilted his head. "You afraid?" Arden smirked, but there was no humor in it. "Not in the slightest." Dain activated the comm. "Delta teams converge on the spire. Keep pressure on their retreating forces. We give them nowhere to run." A chorus of affirmatives answered back. Dain started forward. "Let's finish this." The council's last stronghold stood like a monument to their arrogance. its towering frame still untouched by the destruction that had swallowed the rest of the city. But for all its strength, for all its fortified walls and automated defenses, it carried the weight of something far worse than decay. It carried failure. Arden exhaled sharply. Of course he is. He's trying to rewrite history before it's even finished being written. Dain's mind clicked into motion. The Council had never truly understood defeat. Their empire had survived by erasing its losses, ensuring no one lived to remember them. Veltan wasn't trying to win anymore. He was trying to deny humanity the satisfaction of its own victory. Dain activated the comm. "Castor, can you block the detonation sequence?" Silence. Then, "Not entirely. I can stall it. Maybe a few minutes, but if we don't reach him before he triggers the final override, there's no stopping it." Dain glanced at the towering structure before them. Every moment wasted brought them closer to erasure. "Then we cut the head off the snake before it coils." Inside the command spire, Chancellor Veltan stood before the console, his expression devoid of hesitation. His officers lingered behind him, some stiff with silent dread, others frozen with realization. The air in the chamber was thick with something unspoken, the unsteady rhythm of shifting feet and quickened breathing. "You hesitate," Veltan said, not looking up. None of them spoke. He continued, fingers moving over the controls with deliberate intent. "You believed this world would break, that these creatures would kneel. And now you stand here shaken because they did not." He lifted his gaze, surveying them with cold amusement. "Do you fear them?" One of the officers swallowed. They are unlike any species we have encountered. Their world, it resists us." Veltan let out a quiet, humorless exhale. "Their world does nothing. It is they who resist, and that is why they must be erased." He turned back to the console, preparing the final override. The spire's reactor, buried beneath layers of reinforced structure, had been converted into a failsafe, a last resort measure in case occupation proved untenable. Now it would serve a different purpose, a purge. Veltan pressed his palm against the biometric scanner. A warning flashed across the heads-up display. "Final detonation, authorization required." His clawed fingers hovered over the last confirmation sequence. And then the lights flickered. Veltan stiffened. The console dimmed for a fraction of a second before a sharp screech of static cut through the speakers. Then a voice. "You should have left when you had the chance." Veltan's eyes snapped to the display just as a manual lockdown override flashed across the interface. He turned sharply. "Who breached our network?" An officer scrambled at another station, fingers flying over the controls. "Sir, we're being jammed. I can't regain access." Veltan's expression darkened. "It's them." Another static burst crackled through the chamber, but this time it wasn't the Resistance's doing. Veltan's gaze flickered to the secondary feed, a live security transmission from the lower levels. The image stuttered, corrupted with interference. But through the distortion, he saw something. Empty halls, vacant checkpoints, abandoned weapons still clutched in lifeless hands. Veltan's claws pressed into the console. "What is this?" The security footage continued flickering, switching between different cameras. Each frame displayed the same chilling reality. His soldiers weren't fighting. They were gone. Veltan turned to his officers, his voice deathly calm. "Report. Where are the remaining ground forces?" No one answered. A cold sensation curled in his gut. The chamber suddenly felt smaller. Dain and his team moved through the lower corridors of the spire, stepping over bodies that had died without a fight. No gunfire had been exchanged here. No defensive wounds. "They ran," Arden muttered, glancing down at a fallen officer whose eyes were still open, mouth twisted in silent horror. "Or they tried to—" Arden exhaled sharply. "Of course he is. He's trying to rewrite history before it's even finished being written." Dain's mind clicked into motion. The Council had never truly understood defeat. Their empire had survived by erasing its losses, ensuring no one lived to remember them. Veltan wasn't trying to win anymore. He was trying to deny humanity the satisfaction of its own victory. Dain activated the comm. "Castor, can you block the detonation sequence?" Silence. Then, "Not entirely. I can stall it. Maybe a few minutes, but if we don't reach him before he triggers the final override, there's no stopping it." Dain glanced at the towering structure before them. Every moment wasted brought them closer to erasure. "Then we cut the head off the snake before it coils." Inside the command spire, Chancellor Veltan stood before the console, his expression devoid of hesitation. His officers lingered behind him, some stiff with silent dread, others frozen with realization. The air in the chamber was thick with something unspoken, the unsteady rhythm of shifting feet and quickened breathing. "You hesitate," Veltan said, not looking up. None of them spoke. He continued, fingers moving over the controls with deliberate intent. "You believed this world would break, that these creatures would kneel. And now you stand here shaken because they did not." He lifted his gaze, surveying them with cold amusement. "Do you fear them?" One of the officers swallowed. They are unlike any species we have encountered. Their world, it resists us." Veltan let out a quiet, humorless exhale. "Their world does nothing. It is they who resist, and that is why they must be erased." He turned back to the console, preparing the final override. The spire's reactor, buried beneath layers of reinforced structure, had been converted into a failsafe, a last resort measure in case occupation proved untenable. Now it would serve a different purpose, a purge. Veltan pressed his palm against the biometric scanner. A warning flashed across the heads-up display. "Final detonation, authorization required." His clawed fingers hovered over the last confirmation sequence. And then the lights flickered. Veltan stiffened. The console dimmed for a fraction of a second before a sharp screech of static cut through the speakers. Then a voice. "You should have left when you had the chance." Veltan's eyes snapped to the display just as a manual lockdown override flashed across the interface. He turned sharply. "Who breached our network?" An officer scrambled at another station, fingers flying over the controls. "Sir, we're being jammed. I can't regain access." Veltan's expression darkened. "It's them." Another static burst crackled through the chamber, but this time it wasn't the Resistance's doing. Veltan's gaze flickered to the secondary feed, a live security transmission from the lower levels. The image stuttered, corrupted with interference. But through the distortion, he saw something. Empty halls, vacant checkpoints, abandoned weapons still clutched in lifeless hands. Veltan's claws pressed into the console. "What is this?" The security footage continued flickering, switching between different cameras. Each frame displayed the same chilling reality. His soldiers weren't fighting. They were gone. Veltan turned to his officers, his voice deathly calm. "Report. Where are the remaining ground forces?" No one answered. A cold sensation curled in his gut. The chamber suddenly felt smaller. Dain and his team moved through the lower corridors of the spire, stepping over bodies that had died without a fight. No gunfire had been exchanged here. No defensive wounds. "They ran," Arden muttered, glancing down at a fallen officer whose eyes were still open, mouth twisted in silent horror. "Or they tried to—" Dain didn't respond. He could feel it now, too, that wrongness in the air, something beyond the war, beyond the bloodshed. The way the lights flickered without reason. The faint distortions in the glass of the overhead panels, like heat-warping reality itself. Then in the distance, a sound. Not a voice, not movement, something else. A deep, low vibration that pressed against the skin, not heard but felt. Arden stiffened. "You hear that?" Dain's jaw clenched. "No." Arden frowned. "What do you mean?" "I don't hear it," Dain interrupted. "But I know it's there." The sensation pressed deeper, threading through the walls, pulsing beneath the floor. It wasn't human. It wasn't council. It was something else. A transmission cut through the comms. Castor, his voice shaken in a way Dain had never heard before. "Veydris," Something just activated deep in the spire. Something old. Not theirs. Not ours. Dain exchanged a look with Arden. The council thought they had built their stronghold upon the ruins of a defeated civilization. They had built it upon something waiting to wake up. Dain lifted his rifle. Then we finish this before it does. And with that, they pressed deeper, toward the heart of the war, and the unknown horror buried beneath it. The air inside the spire was wrong. Dain Veydris led his team deeper into the heart of the structure, where the corridors seemed to breathe with something unseen. The walls pulsed faintly, a vibration threading through the floors, too deep to register as sound but impossible to ignore. It wasn't mechanical. It wasn't natural. It was waiting. Castor's voice crackled in his earpiece. "Veydris, I've run every scan I can. Whatever's under that spire, it's not on any council blueprint. It's not even in their classified logs." "Then it's not theirs," Dain murmured. Arden Vaz scanned the flickering emergency lights ahead, fingers tight on his rifle. "If it's not theirs, whose is it?" No one answered. They moved in calculated silence, stepping over abandoned weapons, past consoles still active but broadcasting nothing. The council had stopped fighting back, not because they surrendered, because they had nowhere left to run. Castor's voice cut back in. "Veltan is still in the command chamber. The detonation sequence is locked. If he gets his hands on the final override, we lose everything." Dain's pace quickened. "Then we take it from him." Veltan had known fear before. He had felt it on war fronts, in battle-torn chambers, in the cold corridors of political failure. But this was different. The heads-up display flickered before him, lines of corrupted data bleeding into static. His officers had fled. Their discipline shattered the moment their soldiers vanished. The last transmission from his security teams had ended in garbled screams, and now the only voices that remained in the chamber were his own ragged breath and the whisper of shifting cables overhead. His claws hovered over the detonation override. His final act. A purge. The doors behind him slid open. Dain Veydris stepped inside. He moved without hesitation, rifle aimed at the Chancellor's chest, his expression unreadable beneath the dim glow of emergency lights. Veltan exhaled slowly. "You should not be here." Dain's voice was quiet, deadly. "Neither should you." The Chancellor straightened, hands tightening behind his back. "You believe this is your victory? You have won nothing. The Council will return. They will correct this mistake, and when they do—" Dain took a step closer, interrupting him. "You still think this is about the Council?" Veltan's brow furrowed. Dain nodded toward the display. "Tell me, Chancellor, what exactly is it you're trying to erase? Because I don't think it's us." Veltan hesitated. Dain watched the flicker of doubt in the Chancellor's stance, the way his eyes darted toward the corrupted console. "You don't even know what's under your feet, do you?" Dain pressed. Veltan inhaled sharply, struggling to keep his composure. "You do not understand the consequences of leaving this structure intact." Dain's voice was like iron. "Then explain it." Veltan's jaw tightened. "There is something beneath this spire, something buried long before the first council fleets arrived. A failure, forgotten, and now it is waking." A beat of silence. Dain didn't lower his rifle. "And you thought the best solution was to burn everything?" Veltan met his gaze, expression unreadable. "The Council does not allow unknown variables." Dain exhaled through his nose. "Then I suppose it's a good thing your Council isn't here anymore." Veltan's lip curled, but before he could respond, the lights flickered violently. The deep vibration in the walls grew stronger. The screens dimmed, and then across every display a single unfamiliar symbol etched itself into the static. Not human, not Council, something else. Veltan froze. Dain lifted his rifle. "It looks like the real war is about to start." The resistance had no time for uncertainty. Dain Veydris moved quickly, issuing rapid commands as his team secured the spire's control room, subduing the last remaining officers. Castor was already slicing into the Council's encrypted systems, working to sever Veltan's access to the detonation codes. "This override is deeper than anything I've seen," Castor muttered. "It's not just a failsafe. It's a contingency for something they were never supposed to find." Dain stood over Veltan, who remained bound, silent, watching the unfolding chaos with something between resignation and bitterness. Dain knelt beside him. "You're going to tell me exactly what you buried down here?" Veltan didn't blink. "It will not matter." Arden spoke up from across the room, scanning intercepted transmissions. "Veydris, the Council fleet. They're cutting off all remaining communications. They've erased Veltan's command codes. He's not their problem anymore." Dain exhaled sharply. "They've abandoned him." Castor continued working, his fingers moving fast, and I think I know why. The deeper I go, the more encrypted layers I hit. They weren't just hiding this from us. They were hiding it from themselves. A deep, resonating tremor rolled through the structure. Not an explosion. Something else. The lights failed completely. For a full 3 seconds, the chamber was plunged into total darkness. Then flickering, broken illumination returned, and something moved in the lower levels. Castor's voice was barely a whisper. "That wasn't us." Dain lifted his rifle, heart hammering, gaze fixed on the security feeds now scrolling erratically across the heads-up display. Every single surveillance camera had gone dark, except for one final feed buried beneath corrupted data. Dain stepped closer, watching as the grainy image flickered to life. A corridor, deep underground, empty, still. Then, from the shadows, a shape, indistinct, wrong, moving without sound, without form, without limitation. Dain exhaled slowly. "What the hell are we looking at?" Veltan's voice was quiet. "The reason the Council feared this planet." Dain didn't move. The shape in the feed twisted, its form bleeding in and out of focus, flickering in and out of visibility, as if reality itself was rejecting it. Then it turned toward the camera, and the screen cut to static. For the first time in his life, Dain Veydris did not feel like the hunter. The chamber pulsed with an unnatural energy, the kind that pressed into the skin, coiling around the ribs like something alive. Dain Veydris stared at the flickering security feed, his muscles locked as the shape in the corrupted footage twisted, contorted, and then looked back. The feed died. A silence deeper than any battlefield fell over the room. Castor barely breathed. "That thing, whatever it is, it just noticed us through a broken surveillance line." Arden exhaled, slow and sharp. "You ever get the feeling we just kicked the wrong anthill?" Dain didn't respond. He turned, stepping toward Veltan, who sat bound, his expression carefully devoid of emotion. Not resignation, not fear, something else. "You've been running from this," Dain said quietly. "Since the moment you landed on Earth, since the first soldiers disappeared, since your fleet abandoned you." Veltan lifted his chin. "The Council was not prepared for a war like this." "You think this is war?" Dain's voice cut through the heavy air. "War was the part where you were still arrogant enough to believe you had control. That's over now. You didn't conquer Earth. You barely survived it." Veltan watched him, something unreadable shifting in his gaze. "And yet, you do not flee." Dain tilted his head slightly. "You still don't understand us, do you?" The spire trembled, dust trickling from the rafters, something deep below pressing against the foundations of the structure. Veltan exhaled. "You have no idea what you are standing on." Dain crouched in front of him, resting his forearms on his knees. His expression was calm, almost clinical. "Then why don't you enlighten me?" Veltan's jaw tightened. "The Council never intended to conquer Earth." Arden scoffed, pacing just beyond them. "That's a bold claim for a species that dropped half its fleet on our heads." Veltan's gaze flickered toward the vibrating walls. "Earth was quarantined." The words settled like a stone in the gut. Castor's fingers hovered over his console. "Quarantined," he repeated slowly. Veltan nodded. "Long before your species crawled out of its infancy, long before you knew what lay beyond your skies, The council marked this world as untouchable. His eyes darkened. We didn't come to claim it. We came because it was waking up. Dain stared at him, waiting. Veltan inhaled sharply. Earth is not just a world, it is a trap. A living cage built to contain something older than every empire in the stars. Something buried beneath your cities, beneath your oceans, beneath the very soil you claim as home. The tremors deepened, the lighting flickered, and somewhere, in the lowest levels of the spire, something knocked. Arden's fingers tightened on his weapon. Why would the council hide this? Veltan's voice was cold. Because the ones who buried it were far more advanced than us, and they did not survive. A heavy silence stretched between them. Castor checked the readings again, eyes narrowing. The seismic readings. It's not random, it's rhythmic, like a pattern. He hesitated. Like a heartbeat. Dain's pulse didn't change. Then we stop it before it fully wakes. Veltan let out a low breath, shaking his head. You cannot. Dain stood, gaze unwavering. Watch me. Veltan exhaled. You are only human. Dain met his eyes, voice steel. Exactly. The moment shattered. A deep, unnatural howl erupted from beneath the spire. Something vast, something uncoiling after centuries of sleep. The ground convulsed, the walls buckled, and through the laser plasma displays, red warnings cascaded down the screens. Castor shouted, It's destabilizing! If this thing is pushing through the rock layers, it's going to... The first explosion tore through the lower levels. Dain moved instantly. We take out the spire's core. Now! Arden grabbed his rifle. You're saying we detonate the thing we spent all this time stopping Veltan from blowing up? Dain's expression didn't shift. We control the explosion, not him. Castor's hands were already flying over the interface. I can redirect the detonation sequence, collapse the structure inward. If we time it right, the shockwave might be enough to bury whatever's beneath us before it fully breaks through. Arden inhaled sharply. And if we don't? Castor didn't answer. Dain turned back to Veltan. You wanted to erase everything here. You're going to help us do it. Veltan's jaw tightened. And if I refuse? Dain leaned in, voice low. Then I make sure you live long enough to see what comes next. Veltan studied him, then exhaled. You're a bastard. Dain nodded. So I've been told. The alarm screamed. Castor snapped, Veydris, now! Dain turned, yanking Veltan to his feet. Move! They ran. The final detonation roared through the ruins, a firestorm engulfing the shattered remnants of the spire. Shockwaves rippled through the ground, sending tremors across the dying battlefield. From orbit, the last retreating council warships watched in absolute silence. The structure collapsed inward, steel and stone folding over itself, layers upon layers of rubble entombing what should never have been unearthed. The seismic readings flatlined. Then, finally, the silence returned. Dain stood at the edge of the ruins, watching the last embers flicker against the night sky. The air tasted of scorched earth, of battle, of something final. The spire was gone. The war was over. Arden exhaled beside him. Tell me we're done. Dain didn't answer. He turned his head, gaze lifting toward the council fleet, what was left of it, drifting at the edge of Earth's gravity well, watching, waiting. Castor's voice cut through the comms. They're receiving a transmission from us. Arden frowned. From who? Castor glanced toward Dain. You. Dain lifted his wrist, activating the transmission manually. His voice carried through the cold, open silence of space, reaching every surviving council officer, every soldier who had thought they were the superior species. You came here believing we were weak. His voice was steady, unyielding. You thought you were claiming a broken world. Instead, you walked into your own grave. Silence. Dain continued. There will be no negotiations, no peace, no second chances. His eyes narrowed. The next time the council steps foot on Earth, you won't be retreating. He let the words settle. Let them burn into the hearts of the conquerors who were no longer conquerors. Then he ended the transmission. The remaining Council warships turned. And for the first time in history, they ran. Earth was not conquered. Earth was never theirs to take.